Thank you very much for inviting me. In fact, I just correction. I am not a doctor, and unfortunately, it was taken from Michael. Michael has a PhD, but it was introduced as Mister, and I got it. So anyway, I. Firstly, I would like to express my appreciation for having the chance to speak before such a distinguished audience and on such sensitive and increasingly pressing topic, one which has dear repercussions on the lives of millions of Egyptian Copts and the future of Egypt itself. It is not only the Copt, it is Egypt. I would also like to thank Coptic Solidarity for inviting me to share my views with you, and more importantly, for their moral, principled stance which they have been able to maintain through such difficult and challenging circumstances for decades. Not only now, in fact, but for decades. As most people present here today are aware, Egypt community is going through a crisis of unseen magnitude in Egypt's modern history. Crisis that threatens its very existence as an integral part of Egypt. But if we are to be honest, we must admit that this crisis extends far beyond the terrorist attacks that started systematically target Egypt's Coptic community since last December. In fact, according to an ISIS ideologue, Egypt has a sectarian conflict which might enable jihad, as was the case in Syria and Iraq. Over the past few years, there has been at least 500 attacks and the acts of discrimination against Copts in Egypt. Around 150 of those were attacks on house of worship, and 75 attacks were on Copts' properties. Those attacks involved around 90 cases of kidnapping and resulted in the deaths of over 170 Copts. Of those 500 attacks and discrimination, around 300 took place after President Sisi was elected as a president. Of the 170 deaths, there are over 100 took place on President Sisi watch. Not to mention that 28 Copts whom were killed by the military at the Maspero massacre in October 2011. The attacks under President Sisi also include 15 mob attacks, which often, as you know, go unpunished, which also reflecting the lack of political will to enforce the rule of law, in particular in those cases, and also which reflect the lack of political community, the lack of political will to protect the Coptic community. It is not only ISIS. In fact, the only group which was held accountable for its attacks against Coptic community, it was the Muslim Brotherhood, not the Salafis. But such accountability, it is because this is a part of the crackdown on this group, and not out of genuine will to protect the Coptic community. But maybe more important in this context is to note that the government doesn't hesitate to prevent Egyptian solidarity stands with Copts to take place. Ladies and gentlemen, it was under President Sisi tenure the Copts, for the first time in Egypt's modern history, have become officially and legally recognized as a sect. This is the first time since 1952, since Elizabeth Pasha and not recognized as equal citizens. This has taken place through the passing of the church building law and dropping, in this context, the long-standing collective demand of Egyptians, Copts and Muslims, for having a unified law for houses of worship. It is noteworthy that by the end of 2014, there were more blasphemy cases at court under President Sisi than there was during the Muslim Brotherhood rule. As phrased by the Coptic Solidarity, in one of its statements, I'm quoting, President Sisi has empowered Salafists to freely spread their fundamentalist teachings. The hate culture and religious bigotry are also expressed in the application of the anti-blasphemy law, which uses religion to suppress freedom of speech. It is not lost on anyone that the Brotherhood openly sectarian discourse towards the Egypt Copts had the habit of translating it into violence. Let us not forget that during the Ittihadiyya clashes of December 2012, the Brotherhood's leadership at the highest level, Khairat al-Shatir and al-Biltagi, accused the Coptic community in public statements of funding and organizing those demonstrations, which effectively inciting sectarian violence by Muslims against Copts. Those accusations were part of a political maneuver to strike sectarian chord in order to advance a political agenda, even if it is at the expense of an entire community safety and also at the expense of Egypt's stability. But also in the same direction, we should note that the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, committed the same crime during the Maspero massacre, when state-owned media controlled by the military transitional government hysterically called on the people to protect the army from the Copts. And they played again on sectarianism to advance their political agendas with an absolute indifference towards the repercussions on Copts and the social cohesion and the stability of Egypt. It is the same. In fact, the Maspero massacre was meant to be a brutal message, brutal, bloody message, to push Copts away from joining other Egyptians in their common struggle for democracy and their rights to citizenship and equality. After the recent consecutive attacks by ISIS, it became clear that the Coptic community elite is at a historically critical moment. I guess there are three options that may determine the fate of Egyptian Coptic community and Egypt, not only Egyptian Coptic. The first option is to stick to the same current course of the Coptic community. If it does, then Egypt may be seeing off the last of its Coptic community in few decades, just as the case was with Egyptian Jews. Given the Sisi government's clear unwillingness and inability to protect them. The second choice is to seek the international community and the United Nations protection. A demand that was voiced recently by Coptic Solidarity after the Minya attack. While I myself acknowledge the legitimacy of seeking the international community help for protection and justice for Copts and all Egyptians, as long as there is no hope in achieving that on the national level. But history and the events that took place in Syria and Iraq have taught us that outside powers, unfortunately, rarely have the appetite and in most cases lack the capacity to protect persecuted minorities on time. The third choice the Coptic community has is to embed itself in the democratic liberal movement. To seek equality, justice, and protection for all Egyptians stuck between the monstrosity of terrorism and the brutality of an indifferent dictatorship. It is through the advancement of a liberal democracy that Copts will find long-term safety, security, and equality in Egypt. However, or whatever the Coptic community's elite chooses, I believe that it is time to consider convincing Bob Tawadros II to entirely devote himself to his religious and spiritual duties, and to abandon the political role he assumes on behalf of the Coptic community. In doing so, Bob Tawadros will give the Coptic community and the elite the needed space to make the right decision. This will be for the greater good of the Coptic community and the Egyptian state itself, as well as for the way Bob Tawadros will go down in history. Ladies and gentlemen, let us not forget that it was the liberal democratic movement and at its core the human rights community that called for justice for the Maspero massacre victims, while state media incited against them. It is the liberal democratic movement that calls for justice for the victims of mob attacks, while the government enforces reconciliatory sessions at the expense of justice, accountability, and safety for Copts. And it is the liberal democratic movement that consistently demands equal citizenship rights to Egypt Copts, as well as other communities, the Bahey, Shia, Europeans, and the Bedouins. Finally, I would like to point that the Coptic Solidarity, in fact, is one of the very few actors with the moral capacity needed for launching this internal debate within the Coptic community. All of us as Egyptians are at a historical juncture. I haven't doubt that in few years we will be looking at the situation of Copts and tie it down to this moment. The only question would be whether we will be looking at one of the integral Egyptian communities or at an extinct or persecuted community that fled its country. Whatever how would be Egypt at that moment, I think we would witness at this moment also a different Egypt. I wish for all the members of the Coptic Solidarity the best of luck with their internal debate and its annual conference. Thank you very much.